The hum of 18-wheelers filled the night air as Jake Owens pulled into a truck stop just outside Amarillo, Texas. The neon glow of the Lonestar Diner flickered against the dark sky, promising hot coffee and a half-decent meal. He rolled his stiff shoulders, feeling the long stretch of highway behind him, and parked his rig alongside a row of sleeping giants, Peterbilts, Kenworths, and Freightliners, all lined up like a convoy taking a much-needed rest. Jake had been on the road for 12 hours straight, running a long haul from Kansas City to Tucson, and the last thing he wanted was another gas station sandwich. A real meal sounded like salvation. As he stepped down from his cab, boots crunching on gravel, he pulled his cab lower against the cool wind, then made his way toward the diner's entrance. Inside, the smell of bacon grease and fresh coffee filled the air. The place had the usual truck stop charm: vinyl booths, faded photos of Route 66 on the walls, and a waitress who looked like she'd been serving coffee since the Eisenhower administration. The truckers inside were scattered, some eating alone with their eyes glued to the Weather Channel, others chatting in pairs about bad traffic, fuel prices, or how their kids were doing in school. Jake chose the booth near the window, stretching his legs under the table, and grabbed the menu, though he already knew he'd end up with steak and eggs just like always. Jake Owens? The voice was familiar enough to make him pause mid-page flip. He looked up, and there, standing just a few feet away, was Eddie Vance, a face he hadn't seen in nearly 15 years. "Well, I can't believe it," Jake said, standing up extending his hand. Eddie took it, shaking with a firm grip before pulling Jake into a half hug, the kind men their age gave when they weren't sure how much affection was too much. "You son of a gun," Eddie said, grinning. "What the hell are you doing here?" "Driving same as you, I reckon." Eddie laughed. "Ain't that something? Never figured you for a trucker back in the day." "Back at you," Jake said, shaking his head. "Last I heard, you were working construction up in Oklahoma." "That was a long time ago," Eddie said, sliding into a booth across from Jake. "Mind if I join you?" "Man, I'd be insulted if you didn't." A waitress chewing gum with all the enthusiasm of a cow working through cud strolled up with a notepad. "What can I get you, hun?" "Steak and eggs," Jake said without hesitation. Eddie smirked. "Make that too. And coffee?" "Absolutely," they said in unison. As the waitress walked off, Eddie leaned back in his seat, shaking his head. 15 years, man. Feels like yesterday we were running around town raising all kinds of hell. Jake chuckled. "Yeah, but our knees probably wouldn't agree." "Speak for yourself," Eddie shot back, though the way he rubbed his shoulder suggested otherwise. They fell into a rhythm quickly, talking about old times, how they used to rebuild dirt bikes together in Eddie's dad's garage, how they got caught sneaking beer into the county fair, how Eddie had once convinced Jake to jump off a bridge into a river that turned out to be way shallower than expected. "Still got the scar on my shin from that genius idea of yours," Jake said, knocking his knuckle against his leg. Eddie grinned. "Yeah, but you survived, didn't you?" "Guess so. But what happened, man? Where'd life take you?" Eddie took a sip of coffee before answering. "After construction dried up, I bounced around. Worked the oil fields for a while. Good money, bad hours. Then I met a guy who ran a trucking outfit. Said I could make decent pay if I got my CDL. Figured why not? Been driving ever since." Jake nodded. "Same here. Got laid off from the plant I was at. Decided I didn't want to be tied to one place anymore. Trucking kind of fit. Pays alright, and I get to see the country." Eddie smirked. "Yeah, but at what cost? You got a family waiting back home?" Jake hesitated a second too long before shaking his head. "Nah, had a wife once, didn't last." Eddie nodded, like he understood without needing details. "Yeah, same story here. 3 years in, we called it quits. Life on the road ain't easy for marriages." Their food arrived, and for a while, conversation slowed as they focused on the meal. The steak was tough but good, and the eggs were exactly the kind of greasy that made them perfect. After a few minutes, Eddie wiped his mouth with a napkin and leaned forward. "You ever get tired of it?" Jake raised an eyebrow. "The driving?" "Yeah." Jake thought about it. "Sometimes. But then I hit a stretch of open road with nothing but sky ahead of me, and I remember why I started doing it in the first place. Feels like freedom, you know?" Eddie nodded. "Yeah, I get that." They sat in companionable silence for a bit, letting the years settle between them like dust on an old back road. "You keep in touch with anyone from back home?" Jake finally asked. "Nah, most of them moved on, scattered like leaves in the wind. You?" "Not really. Life happens." Eddie stirred his coffee absent-mindedly. "We ought to change that." Jake looked up. "Yeah?" "Yeah. I mean, what are the odds we'd run into each other out here after all these years? Ain't that worth something?" Jake smiled. "I'd say so." Eddie reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. "Here, give me your number. Next time we're in the same neck of the woods, we'll grab another meal. Jake took out his own phone and they swapped numbers, locking into a promise neither wanted to break. As they finished their coffee, Jake glanced out the window at the long road stretching ahead. The miles would keep coming, the trucks would blur together, and the nights would sometimes feel lonelier than they should. But now at least there was one more number in his phone, one more friend still out there on the road, rolling through the same highways and truck stops, making the country feel just a little bit smaller. And that, Jake figured, was worth more than he'd realized. Thanks for joining us on the open road, where anything can happen and there's always another adventure right around the corner. Remember to like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time on the open road.